So a lot of times what I find is that people have been expending more effort, trying harder, but they haven't really necessarily been doing more performance-wise in the gym. So they've removed the primary adaptation to get a positive response, and they've kind of worked their calories down so low that there really isn't anywhere else for them to go. And the hard part is that adding and subtracting calories is not a pure linear process. And that's where I think a lot of people get hung up, meaning that does it affect your results? Of course it does. Is it as simple as always dropping 500 calories, right, every day per week as the old 3,500? Does that mean you will magically lose a pound every week? Not really.
Welcome to the Calorie Conundrum Podcast with Coach Strick. Join us as we expand the weight loss conversation to beyond just calories and dare to ask the question, why does eating less and exercising more sometimes not produce the desired results? Here's Coach Strick to discuss this Calorie Conundrum.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Calorie Conundrum Podcast. This is Coach Strick. And today we have another podcast archive interview with Dr. Mike T. Nelson. Dr. Mike has a wealth of knowledge, and you can find more about human performance and metabolic flexibility by visiting his website, mikenelson.com. Let's find out about metabolic flexibility and how it is affecting your health and weight.
Strick, and today I'm talking with Dr. Mike T. Nelson. Dr. Mike has a bachelor's degree in natural science, a master's degree in mechanical engineering, and a doctorate in exercise physiology, and multiple fitness certifications, including being certified strength and conditioning specialist. Dr. Mike loves research and has published peer-reviewed papers and is constantly reading and investigating ways to increase performance and decrease body fat. His PhD dissertation was about metabolic flexibility, which I'm sure we'll learn about today. Dr. Mike, welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Greatly appreciate it. Awesome.
Yeah. Dr. Mike, your dissertation was on metabolic flexibility, and you also wrote an ebook about this subject. What exactly is this metabolic flexibility?
Yeah, so the nice part about metabolic flexibility is it treats your metabolism as more of a sort of a complex kind of changing system. So pretty much, if you look online, everyone talks about, I hear this for carbohydrate metabolism and, do this to increase fat metabolism. And both those, I think, generally are pretty correct for the most part. But metabolic flexibility looks at, both of those, but how do you switch back and forth between them, right? So if you're going to do a heavy weight training session, the main fuel that's used is primarily carbohydrates. And then actually during your rest periods, you actually switch to use the main fuel as actually fat. The metabolic flexibility is both on a small scale and a larger scale. How is your body switching between both of those fuel sources? So we'll simplify it down to fats and carbohydrates for now. So it's how is your body changing fuel sources to meet the need that's there.
So basically what you're saying is that you want your body to be able to use both forms of fuel and be efficient at both? Is that basically what you're saying?
Yep. And you want the ability to switch back and forth fast. So, for example, if you were to go do a weight training session, and you could not switch to use carbohydrates as fast, your performance is going to be potentially hampered a little bit, right? So an extreme example is a disease called McArdle's disease. And in these patients, they actually can't break down glycogen, so stored carbohydrates that are in the muscle specifically here. And what you find in those patients is that they have a very hard time with higher intensity exercise, right? Because their body is missing the fuel in order to use for that. Now that's an extreme example, but it just shows that if you have a hard time using the fuel to power the exercise, right, your exercise performance go down. So metabolic flexibility is looking at also the rate of which you can get energy and as those systems change, right? So in one study, they looked at a group of subjects, and they found that those who were lacking metabolic flexibility had a harder time changing back to using fats after the exercise, right? They eventually got there, but it just took them a much longer time to get to that point. So it's looking at both how well you can use carbs and fats, and then how fast your body can respond to meet those sort of energy needs.
Yeah, so basically you're saying that we want that.
Yeah, and that's a good thing, right? And it's hard because even a lot of, the textbooks and everything that's written, and, and I teach exercise physiology too, and I don't think people do this intentionally, but a lot of the way that it's taught is these sort of static, sort of mental pictures you have in your brain, right? Oh, yeah, this is what this looks like. Oh, here's this muscle. Oh, here's this. And in reality, what you have is multiple systems that are all going on at the same time. It's just a lot of times the rate is different. So I imagine, I used to DJ in college for a while. I had a radio show and all that kind of stuff. So I imagine that your fuel selection on your metabolism is kind of like if you've ever used a fader switch between, mixing, the record on the left with the record on the right. You always have, some input from each one. You can just kind of change the percentage of what comes from where, right? And you can also change how fast you move from one to the next. So being able to move faster from one to the next and to get a higher percentage of each one is going to be more beneficial, right? So if we look at type 2 diabetics, they're what you would call metabolically inflexible. And everybody kind of knows that the basic definition is that, they have a hard time using carbohydrates, right? So they have a harder time going, sort of if you look at a spectrum, all the way to the right-hand side to use carbohydrates to their full degree. And what you find is as the disease progresses, they actually end up with issues related to the use of fat, fatty acid metabolism. So if we picture that on the left-hand side, so now they, can't move as fast from carbohydrate to fat metabolism, and their spectrum kind of gets squished from each end, right? They can't go all the way up to the right to use carbs. They can't go all the way down to the left to use fats. And then we find that that's a pretty good marker for a disease state. So I would say metabolic flexibility can be not also a marker for performance, but also for health in general, right? So health is just sort of how all the systems in your body sort of are coordinated and working well together.
Yeah, I think you make a good point when you say that, people try to look at the body in such simplistic, ideas and views. And in reality, there's almost infinite amount of pathways and, systems, kind of integrated and working together, and they all rely on each other. They all rely on each other, and so you can't really look at the body as eat less carbs or eat more carbs or whatever. It's everything combined together, which makes the whole system work. And
I'm a big fan of that. The body is very complex in all the physiology systems and everything that it does. But the cool part is that it boils down to rather simplistic action, right? I mean, we could argue all day about, the different things that have to happen in order to do a deadlift, right? From neural impulses to the neuromuscular junction to the, changing to acetylcholine to blah, 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 all the way through. But at the end of the day, basically pick something up off the ground, right? I mean, there's different cues and ways to teach deadlifts and all that kind of stuff. But in relation to all the things that have to happen correctly, doing a deadlift is a rather simple action. So the nice part is that the actions that you actually do are rather simple, which is pretty good. So it's kind of like I have an iPhone, and I don't know what the hell the thing does in the background, but I know I press little icons on the screen, and it does some cool stuff, right?
Yeah.
So that as the interface becomes better, you can run more complicated stuff in the background. And at some level, it may be good to learn about that if you're trying to, get better at specific things. But you don't necessarily have to know all that in order to operate it, right? It's like you don't have to know anything about how an iPhone works in the background to teach, a kid how to run it, right? So metabolism, we kind of think of it as the same way. Right? A lot of people don't even know anything about how their metabolism works, and they're still alive, still working. Could be a little bit better, but they're still up and around. So
I really like that analogy. That's a really good point you've made there. But what you mentioned there, and what was as my next question, you said all you have to do for the deadlift was pretty much pick stuff up, and people are probably thinking, what is a deadlift or an exercise in the gym where you pick something off the ground? What does that have to do with metabolic flexibility? And my next question was going to be, I read your book, and you say you should allow performance to drive results.
Yep.
Why did you say that, and what does that mean?
Sure. And so this is geared at, I would say, probably most, I would say athletes, even beginner athletes, in that if you go all the way back, right? So when I looked at it, I wanted to say, okay, what are the main things that drive, let's say, for example, body composition, right? Because most people are interested in performance, and the reality is most people are more interested in fat loss, which totally cool. I understand that, and I think that's awesome. So then we look at, okay, what are the factors that drive fat loss? Obviously, there's a nutrition component. And then for the exercise component, of course, you've got, calories burned and other things that go into that. And at the end of the day, the main thing that you would want to track is literally how much work did you do, right? What kind of things did you do in the gym? Right? So if you go to a job, your boss is probably going to have you track, your progress towards your projects or, whatever you're working on, your reason for doing that job, right? It's some type of performance metrics would be tracked. But for whatever reason, when we go to the gym, it's kind of like entering the Bizarro world, and people tend to do the inverse of everything they've ever done before in their life. I don't really know why that is, but I mean, how many commercial type gyms have you been in where people don't even write anything down? It's like, how do you know if you did more than last week, right? You're probably not going to remember all those individual numbers in your head. So I think by having that be performance driven, if you're actually doing more overload, right, so you're applying more stress to your system that your body can adequately recover from, then you have a positive stimulus for change, right? So that I had one guy, one of the first clients I worked with years ago, he came to me and he had all sorts of overuse injuries, hadn't made any progress for, body composition or performance. And so I asked him, I said, what is the, routine you've been doing lately? And he pulls out this like tattered sheet of paper that's been taped together like 4 times and sets it down and goes, oh, here's what I've been doing. And I said, okay. I said, well, how long have you been doing this? I think he said something like 7 years. It was way more than 5 years, I know, and I can't even remember the exact amount of years. It was way more than 5, I know that. And I looked at him, and I thought he said, 7 months or 7 weeks, and he said, no, like 7 years. I'm thinking, holy crap, and all these thoughts go through my head at the same time. My first thought was, oh crap, no wonder you haven't made any progress. No wonder you've got overuse injuries. No wonder you feel horrible. And my second thought was, wow, that's a lot of very odd, misplaced motivation, I guess you could say, for lack of a better word. And I asked him, I said, well, why, help me understand. I said, why were you doing the same program for 7 years but it wasn't working? like, well, I saw a trainer years ago, and he told me that this was the program for me, and then I should just follow this one. I'm like, holy crap. So as you can imagine, right, there's no different stimulus for the body, right? There's no progressive overload that you have to do a little bit more, right? And at some point, he actually started going backwards, right? Because the body is always adapting, right? So we're always either getting better or getting worse. And if we do the exact same thing all the time, eventually our body's like, I've done that. And then at some point it actually starts to get worse, right? So by tracking overload, which is simply one, just the intensity, right, or the fancy word is the percentage of your 1 rep max. So how much weight did you have on the bar? Another one is volume, right? So you can think of volume as just simply work, right? So we take the weight times the sets times the reps. We assume, the distance is going to be fixed for that exercise, right? You're not going to do, vastly different stuff for bench press from one session to the next. And if we assume that your speed is, relatively fast and consistent. So that's literally how much work you've done. So if you do the old, DeLorme bench press routine of 3 by 10 for 3 on Monday, that's, International Bench Press Day, right? If you did 200 pounds, 3 sets, and 10 reps, right? So you've got, let's say, 200 times 3 is 600, right? Times another 10, so 6,000 pounds, right? That's how much work you physically did. And the last one is just work divided by time, or volume divided by time is density. So if that training session took you 12 minutes and 37 seconds, and you repeat it the following Monday in 11 minutes and 7 seconds, well, you did the same amount of work, but the rate at which you could do it, or the density, is better, right? So that's a positive stimulus for adaptation. So what I found is, when I work with new clients, I literally just have them track their performance. And in pretty much almost every case where they're completely stuck, they've been kind of inadvertently doing the same thing all the time, right? So the stimulus that's applied to their body isn't really any different. And their body's like, well, I don't know why I need to change. It's the same thing I did last week and the week before. I don't know. This isn't hard, right? But the funny part is, the more and harder they try, at some point they may feel worse. So performance is just simply tracking those 3. And by looking at that, you then know at least, are you applying a positive stimulus to the body to get an adaptation you want, right? So you're applying a stimulus, and you hopefully get a positive adaptation then, right? So stronger, better performance, possibly body composition changes. But without that in place, I think you're really spinning your wheels, and it becomes much harder, and then people just end up equating anything that they did in the gym by how hard they worked, not necessarily how much work did they do, and that gets, I think, kind of a slippery path. It'd be like going to work and being like, hey, I'm going to, try to be just as destroyed as I possibly can before I leave. Well, that doesn't make any sense, right? You ideally want to, do as much work, as you can, and then leave the gym and still, feel pretty good. And I'm not the first person to ever talk about this. I know Charles Staley's talked about it a fair amount, and he talked to any other high-level coaches, and, they're all pretty keen on what is the highest quality of work I can have my athletes do. I talked to Cal Dietz here at the U of M, and he's got different ways of measuring, how can I get, these athletes to do the highest quality of work first and then get them to do more. So.
All right. And I have a point I would like to bring up. When I read your book, you were talking about allow performance to drive results. And one thing that you said that I know is not going to sit well with a lot of people that want to lose weight, you said when you start doing this, you may not lose weight, or you may even gain weight at first. So what do you say to someone that, has tried everything and nothing has worked, to make them feel a little bit more comfortable, or make them believe that they'll be able to lose weight after they possibly gain a little at first?
Yeah, because it's the hard part is, I think people sort of back themselves into a corner, because everything is, very restrictive type space. And, yes, I agree that, calories in, calories out matter. I'm not saying that stuff doesn't matter. But if you take an example, let's say somebody comes in, and my wife actually asked me this question yesterday. She was doing some stuff on an online calculator, and she's like, well, what are the average calories per day for a female? And I was like, well, what's the reason for the question? She's like, well, this online calculator tells me I'm only supposed to eat 1,200 calories a day. Like, well, it's probably, I'd say, on the lower end, especially for someone who's pretty active. But say you're that person and you're, in maintenance, right, at 1,200 calories, right? So you're not gaining, you're not really losing anything. So we'll say for simple math, we'll say that your total calories you expend is just 1,200, right? So yes, you could go down in theory to 1,000, maybe 800 and lose weight, right? Assuming that we do this correctly, hopefully that could be more body fat, not just weight. It depends on how you do it. But what do you do at that point then, right? So you're going to live the rest of your life on 800 calories a day? That doesn't sound like any fun at all. So a lot of times what I find is that people have been expending more effort, trying harder, but they haven't really necessarily been doing more performance-wise in the gym. So they've removed the primary adaptation to get a positive response, and they've kind of worked their calories down so low that there really isn't anywhere else for them to go. And the hard part is that adding and subtracting calories is not a pure linear process. And that's where I think a lot of people get hung up, meaning that does it affect your results? Of course it does. Is it as simple as always dropping 500 calories, right, every day per week as the old 3,500? Does that mean you will magically lose a pound every week? Not really, right? You may lose 2 pounds initially and then nothing the next week, right? So it works out, but it's not a pure linear response. And that has to do with all sorts of stuff like diet-induced thermogenesis and, NEAT and how much you move and all that other kind of stuff. But so what I do with those people is that you're kind of at a point where you really can't do any more restriction. And on more of the mental side, or I guess for lack of a better word, psychology, although I prefer the term neurobiology, just talking to him, it just doesn't really work, right? So one of the early clients I worked with, he was a little more overweight, and I, read his diet thing. He said, he eats lots of Oreos. I'm thinking, it's so simple. Stop eating Oreos, right? I'm smart, right? Woo! Fixed all of his, fat loss problem. Well, as you can imagine, that didn't really work so well, right? He actually ate more Oreos the more I told him not to eat Oreos, right? Don't think of a pink elephant, right? And the adult human brain can't really process a negative, right? So even though I told you don't think of the pink elephant, you still thought of the pink elephant, right? So what I find is that in practice, both on both sides of the equation, I have much better results telling people what to do, not what not to do, right? So if I look at their nutrition log and I'm thinking, well, they're probably eating maybe too many calories, maybe too many carbohydrates, I have better luck with telling them eat a lot more protein and possibly fiber than I tell them just don't eat as many carbohydrates, right? So I'm big on telling them what they should do and having that sort of push out everything else. And for a while, back to our example, that may mean that you, for a while, are eating 1,400 calories, right, that you're working back up, because we also need something to drive those performance changes, right? So even if you gain, let's just say 50-50, right? Let's say you gain 2 pounds of lean mass and 2 pounds of fat, right? You are going to be 4 pounds heavier. But it's not going to take you long once you get your performance in check and you get some better nutrition, increase your calories a little bit, to go back down a little bit and lose those 2 pounds of fat, right? And so that's the thing where people get stuck, is that they've kind of backed themselves into a corner. And then also for long-term progress, I find that they just need to focus on the things that they can do. So whether that's, more protein or, timing carbohydrates, around training, all that kind of stuff, that when they focus on what they can do and then monitor their response, pretty much everyone does a lot better. And that's also much more sustainable long term, right? So now if you have someone who is, let's say, a female, pretty active, and their, let's say, weight is maintained on 1,800 calories a day, well, it's pretty easier to live your life than it is on 800 calories a day, right? So I think that's kind of where that's all about. So it has both a physiology side and also kind of a psychology side too, because I'm not a big fan of, here's a list of bad foods you should never eat. Are some foods better than others? Of course. I remember John Berardi saying once, he's like, if you lived on a desert island and then all of a sudden a case of peanut M&Ms got dropped from the sky and that's all you had to eat, peanut M&Ms are pretty damn good, right? But, in the real world, if you have access to other things, I would say there's probably, better nutritional choices you can make. Does that mean if you ate a bag of peanut M&Ms one day, you're a bad, horrible person? No. So I think if I could wave my magic nutrition wand and I could get rid of just one thing, it would be people's wacky ideas about food, because that's usually the biggest sticking point.
So on that, and on that point, carbs. I know a lot of paleo and low carb diets are based on kind of avoiding carbs. Do we need carbs, and if so, why?
So I think I always answer this from, it depends on the population you're looking at. So if you look at, I would say the average American, right, to pick on them, they're not really that active. They don't get a lot of exercise. I mean, heck, they don't even really move that much anymore compared to what they used to. If you take those people and put them on a much lower carbohydrate diet, would they do better? Yep, they definitely do seem to do better, right? Because they probably have a harder time using carbohydrates. And unfortunately, carbohydrates they pick tend to not be very nutrient dense, so they're missing other, micronutrition and that kind of thing. For that population, do they need 6 to 11 servings of healthy grains a day? No. Right? They do much better with, higher protein, moderate-ish fat, more fruits, more vegetables, really kind of basic stuff. If you look at more of an athletic population, though, at least some of the people I've worked with, they tend to go the other extreme, right? So I've worked with a few people who have done CrossFit, not to pick on CrossFit, but, high energy system type work, and then they try to match that with a very low carbohydrate diet. And in my experience, that'll work for about 4 to 6 weeks, unless you're some weird genetic freak, and then usually the wheels come off at that point. As if you're in the gym doing work that requires high amounts of carbohydrates as the main fuel source, and then now you start restricting them, you're going to have a pretty hard time, right? So the experiment I have most of those people do is track your performance, and then we'll slowly increase your carbohydrates, and then we'll keep tracking your performance. And most of the time, what you'll see is their performance goes up. I had a guy email me a couple months ago. It's like, I put 15 pounds on my clean and jerk in like 3 weeks. I've been stuck at the same weight for a year and a half. The only thing we did different was I had him eat more carbohydrates. It's amazing that how often that works really well, right? So it goes back to what we talked about before, that if your performance is dropping or going down, right, trying to, change your body composition is going to be pretty hard unless you get like uber restrictive, which is going to be kind of a one-way temporary street. The question then you get is, well, how many carbohydrates do I eat? And I wish I had a really simple answer for that, but man, it depends a lot. I mean, I've seen people get, super lean, like step on stage ready on 50 grams of carbohydrates to 300 grams of carbohydrates a day, sometimes even higher. Sure. I don't know why. I mean, if you look in the literature, it's all across the board on what is a good marker for, insulin sensitivity, whether it's a clamp study, a HOMA score, insulin levels, glucose levels, whatever. So it's pretty hard to tell. Even within body types, it'll be different. So usually the leaner the person is, the better their tolerance for carbohydrates, but that's not always true, I would say. So in the end, you're left with, running a short experiment to see, how well you respond to carbohydrates. And what you're trying to find is kind of the sweet spot where your performance is good and going up, and your body composition is either getting better or about the same, right? If your body composition now is all of a sudden starting to get dramatically worse, assuming you've got other stuff in place that's good, now I would then have you scale back a little bit on carbohydrates, right? So you're trying to find the sweet spot of where your performance is good and your body composition is, staying about the same or possibly even getting a little bit better.
Yeah, and I think that's, the point that any kind of diet book or, recommendations for health and wellness should be is that, everyone's different. And so
totally.
What works for one person, for their husband or wife or friend or neighbor, it could be the complete opposite. And so that's why everyone has to just kind of figure out what works for them and, trial and error kind of deal.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I would say that there are, some general basic guidelines that most people do better with. Eating more protein, about 0.75 grams per pound of body weight as a min. Most people tend to do pretty good on that. More fruits, more vegetables, more fiber, that kind of stuff. But once you get beyond sort of the basics of stuff and you're more in the fine tuning, yeah, I would definitely agree that, that will vary quite a bit from one person to the next. And I have a few people that do really well on lower carbohydrate approaches and they exercise a fair amount. Most people do a little bit better with more carbohydrates, but, again, that's going to vary quite a bit.
Yeah. All right. Also in your book, you wrote exercise. You believe exercise is the single most important component you should change about your lifestyle to improve your metabolic flexibility. You said that there's two different ways that you can use exercise to help with your metabolism and losing fat and gaining muscle. One was weight training, and you said some, stuff about compound exercises and how weight training is basically kind of like the engine and the fuels. The bigger your engine, the more fuel you can burn. So your RMR, resting metabolic rate, is increased from weightlifting, and also your EPOC, or your excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, is increased from weight training. And then the other side of that exercise, teeter-totter, you said that one of the points is to improve. What you want to do is improve your mitochondrial function. And the way you said that they did that in the studies was using a Wingate exercise bike test. And you said that basically what that is high-intensity interval training. And my question is, those are kind of like two separate, forms of exercise. One's weight training. One's kind of more of a cardio type, high intensity kind of thing. My question was, do you think it's possible to use weight training as a high intensity interval training form of exercise? So kind of killing two birds with one stone?
Yeah. I think you can. I think it all depends on what type of adaptation you're trying to get and, how trained you are. So I think if you took, let's say, the average person that's new and hasn't done a lot of, strength training or even formal exercise, and you give them sort of old school circuit-based type, weight training / cardio-ish type program, would they do pretty good on that? Yeah, I think they would. I mean, you're getting some, cardiac demands, you're getting some overload to the tissue, you're kind of killing two birds with one stone. I would say, though, that as they get a little bit more advanced, that model at some point you're going to run into only so much you can do with that. So the next progression I would have with those people, and I do have some people start on those types of programs just because that's kind of what they were used to in the past. And then the next thing I would do is I would add 1 day of heavier weight training. So by heavier is all relative, but, 5 reps and under, right? Because most people tend to stay in the 10 to 15 rep range, especially women. And then I would also add in 1 day of just more interval-based training, whether that's, fast, sprinting repeats on a bike is pretty good. If you have access to it, like hard pushes are really good, sled drags. The hard part on the interval day is that people have a habit of trying to make that back to sort of a circuit type thing again. And I think there is benefit to that, but, the thing is you'll have clients that are like, yeah, I did that, interval day you did, and so how did it go? Like, that was pretty good. Yeah, I went really hard for the entire 20 minutes. I'm thinking, well, I only rode it for 10, and if you went really, really hard the entire time for 20 minutes, I guarantee you didn't go really, really hard, so you can't do that for 20 minutes, right?
Yeah.
It's like, go sprint. No one sprints a marathon, right? I mean, yeah, the people who win marathons are freaking fast, but if you had them sprint, they can run faster than, their marathon pace. So that's the hard part of trying to differentiate them to do a shorter output in time, but higher sort of work, right? So Wingate, when most people don't have access to Wingate bikes, but it's really, really, really high work output for very short periods of time, 20, 30 seconds. And I used to run these in the lab all the time as part of the experiments we were doing. And you describe them to people, and they're like, oh, yeah, that's pretty easy. And it's, about halfway through, it feels like somebody dumped concrete in your legs. And we used to have the over-under pool in the lab of how many people would puke after they got off, doing the Wingate. And this is from just one Wingate. So if you're talking high-intensity stuff, you can't do a lot of it. So that's the other part. So my advice is that if you can, split those out a little bit, and then that also kind of keeps all your adaptations moving in the same direction. There isn't as much what they call, the technical terms, interference between weight training and high interval training. But as you get lower in intensity, there can be more interference, right? So at the simplest level, we don't see elite powerlifters or bodybuilders winning marathons, right? Because we know that the strength adaptation is different than an aerobic adaptation. Now, you can increase both of those, definitely, and you can definitely get better in both. But I think if that's your goal, having them split out in your programming, I think is going to be better. There's not a ton of research on that, and the research on it is really kind of split. But I'm a big fan of, pick what adaptation you want to achieve, and then focus on that, at least for most of the session in the gym. All right, so if your goal is to get stronger, most of your stuff in the gym should be, 5 reps and unders, strength work, right? Can you do another day where it's more hypertrophy based? Yeah. Maybe the next day is more hypertrophy based. So maybe you're doing, what I call the old school dude bra training, doing the arm curls and pull downs and, whatever for higher reps. I actually find that helps with hypertrophy and actually alleviates a lot of joint issues too. But I think if you can do those on separate days, although there's not a ton of research that's looked at this yet, I think you'll get better results. At least that's what I've seen in people. And especially as the athletes become more advanced, I think you really need to specialize what adaptation you want to get. And on the uber high end, you end up with almost like a Russian block periodization, right? And these are for, pretty advanced athletes that have been training for years and years, probably more than decades, that you just need to get so much stress in one particular area to get a positive adaptation that you have to run some type of system like that. So.
Yeah, I had a question about the high intensity interval training. Is that relative as well, like from person to person? Like, is it a certain amount of VO2 max, percentage of VO2 max, or how is that determined on how hard people should go on that? Because I know the example you gave where you say, yeah, do these intervals 10 minutes, and they come back and tell you, oh, yeah, it was easy, or, yeah, I did it for 20 minutes or something, and you're like, well, you did it wrong, you know. How hard, what determines how hard you should go on those intervals?
Yep. So you can use fancy stuff in the lab, right? So if you look at, hook people up to metabolic heart, I've done a whole bunch of metabolic heart stuff, right? So that'll tell you, VO2 and other, metabolic, for lack of a better word, breathing numbers, right? So how much air are you exchanging, how much, carbon dioxide, oxygen, that type of stuff. You can look at lactate levels, prick their finger or wherever you're taking a lactate sample from, ear or whatever, and then that can tell you some information. But in practice, most people don't have either one of those. So what I find is having them do an RPE. So RPE is rating of perceived exertion, and that's just a simple 1 through 10 scale. So 1 would be, I just got off the couch, I'm walking around, I'm not doing much. 10 would be, there's a bear chasing me and I'm running for my life, right? So you have to kind of qualify both ends of the spectrum. And if I work with the client, I'll even have them do, okay, this session, it'll be about a 5 RPE for you, and then this session will be around a 9 or a 10, right? So as long as they have no restrictions and you're comfortable pushing them, so now they have an experience to kind of anchor both those ends so they know where they're at. The other thing I really like doing is monitoring their heart rate, because 1, it's, feedback on their biologic system. And then 2, it's pretty easy to do now. And so there I'll usually program a percentage of their heart rate. Ideally, the numbers they give you, the old, 220 minus your age, it's a rough ballpark. The standard deviation on that is actually pretty high. So if I can, I'll have someone actually do a very hard workout, so an RPE of a 9 or a 10, and then see what their max heart rate is. So let's say their max heart rate gets up to 186. And then maybe in a couple months I'll have them repeat it again. And now they get, 190. Okay, so now I'm going to use 190, right? I'm going to try to use what their actual max is. But if you test enough people, you'll find that the max runs quite a bit different from the predicted formula. And then I'll just do percentages off of that. So for interval-based stuff, it's usually a pretty high percentage, but it's very short in duration. Like for high-intensity interval stuff, I don't know, I'd say I have most people do even the 10, 20, maybe 30-second work. I'd say that's probably pretty typical. If they're competing in an event where they have to do some lactate-based work, especially around the minute mark, so if they do a strongman competition, reps for 60 seconds or something like that, then it will add in more specific work for that, pathway, which is more lactate intensive. But usually I find that the time and then the intensity can be done via a heart rate, and that usually works out pretty good. And it's equipment that they normally have access to, and it's not too big of a pain in the butt factor either.
All right. Well, we're almost out of time, but I really wanted to hit one more subject area.
Yeah.
And topic area. And in your book, you wrote about broken diet methodologies, and you list 3 different broken diet methodologies. The first one being eat less, do more, which is what most people do. They want to work out more and they want to eat less. The second one was extreme deficit dieting, and that was basically where people are starving themselves. And the third one is eat a lot less and do a lot more. And this is kind of what I wanted to talk about, is that this can kind of lead to a subject you covered in your book called metabolic damage. Can you give us your perspective on what exactly metabolic damage is and how it comes about, and even if you can depict it or not?
Yeah. So metabolic damage usually just and I use that term kind of on purpose because that's the term that's thrown around online for the most part. The term itself makes it sound like you damaged your metabolism so bad that it can never be repaired, right? And that part in general is not true. There's some pretty extreme circumstances that you may run into other issues, and obviously you may need help from a physician or that type of thing. But for the most part, your metabolism is much more, I would say, robust than what we believe. I would say all of physiology in your body in general is pretty damn robust. I mean, you look at, people who live for weeks, months, and years on eating stuff that you think is horrible, right? 7-Eleven Slurpees with no ice. Like, I'm amazed your body even knows what the hell to do with that, right? If I put sugar in the gas tank of my car, I'm not even going to make it around the block, right? So it always amazed me that you've got people who do everything wrong and still live pretty long, right? I mean, they're not, keeling over tomorrow, right? On the flip side, if you're looking for, the highest of elite type performance, yeah, then a lot of, smaller tweaks and changes can make a big difference. But, there you're talking about 1/10 of a second is a freaking eternity, right? So it all depends on what you're looking at. But in terms of metabolic damage, the term itself would imply that your metabolism can be permanently damaged, which is generally not true. But there is changes to your metabolic rate over time, right? So as we talked about in the past, your metabolic rate can actually go up and down. Everyone kind of knows this, but the thing that's interesting is just simply eating more calories will actually drive your metabolic rate up. Now, that may not go up at the same rate of how much food you're eating, but eating more will tend to drive it back up. Exercise, for the most part, as long as it's not, extreme and exhaustive, that type of thing, does tend to help, right? So if you can add more muscle, that does tend to help your basal metabolic rate. How much more that helps? Everyone wants to know, well, if I put on 1 more pound of muscle, how many more calories do I burn per day? Most of the stuff on that shows it's probably a pretty small number. But you have to remember that all these numbers are then compounded by time. So even if it's a small number, but it's consistent, and that's, today, tomorrow, next year, a lot of those things can add up. Because if we look at obesity, most of it is what they call creeping obesity, right? Where people may gain, maybe only a few pounds per year, right? Maybe 5, maybe 10 pounds a year. That's only like less than a pound a month, right? So, but you fast forward 3 years and you're gaining 10 pounds a year and you're now 30 pounds overweight, right? So the human body in general can regulate calories in, calories out to very, very high precisions, but even being off by single-digit percentage when compounded over time makes a big difference. So your metabolic rate can go up and down. So when people talk about metabolic damage, they're usually referring to people that ate really, really low calories, did way too much exercise, and then now their metabolism doesn't seem to respond as well. If you look in the literature, the short version is, it does appear that your metabolic rate is rather plastic or can change, but it appears that there's kind of a bottom end on it. So the stories you hear of people, well, my metabolic rate now is only 600 calories a day. Like, I would like to see the data on that, right? Is it possible? Maybe, right? We only have a handful of studies to look at, but I would say very low numbers in basal metabolic rate so far haven't really been found. And one of the myths is that if people are rather overweight, that they have a low metabolic rate. And most of the time, their basal metabolic rate, so their metabolic rate just to make it around if they don't do anything else, is usually not super low, right? Because it's got to support that amount of mass. So there is more research that's being done. I know a couple researchers that are looking at possibly using more, fitness competitors or people that have done much more extreme things to see what changes we see in them. Maybe we'll find that there are more extreme changes that just haven't been documented yet. But in general, you can't completely crush your metabolic rate. You can change it, you can bring it up, you can bring it down. But as the literature is right now, it doesn't look like you can just completely flatline it, right? And that makes sense if you think that the body is basically survival-based. If you could crush your metabolic rate, you would have all sorts of other issues, and at some point you're going to impact your ability to survive, right? So while it's not the most accurate study for various reasons, comparison to today, the Minnesota starvation study, which I talked about in the book, they took people that, were objecting to the war, and they were trying to do a study to simulate what it would be like to be in a prison camp and to come back and, what changes do they need to make. And the short version is that they restricted calories very substantially. What they did do is that they did not allow the people to then downregulate the amount of activity they were doing. So they literally forced them to stay active, right? Because if you drop your calories super fast, you almost always drop the amount of energy you expend, right? You just unconsciously don't move as much, right? You talk to anyone who's done a competition to step on stage at very lean body weights, and pretty much across the board, and there's some case studies in the literature now that you're tired, you don't feel good, don't want to move a lot, right, when you get to the extreme levels. So in this study, they did force them to keep moving. They all lost weight, right? There wasn't people that didn't lose any weight. And they actually became, very, very, lean, for lack of a better word, not in a good way. They had a lot of muscle loss too. But what you found is that psychologically they kind of went a bit nuts. All they did was they thought about food. They would give them food, and they would, cut it into, small pieces to try to spread out how long it took them to eat it. They had one guy who was collecting pictures of food in cookbooks, and, so a lot of stuff, it went a little bit nutty. So there are, costs for doing that, both on the physiology and the psychology side. So what do you do with all that in practice? I just don't think it's a good idea to dramatically cut your calories super aggressively overnight. One, it's not needed. Two, you're going to run out of room of where to go. Will you damage your metabolism by doing that? I wouldn't say damage is the right word. May you have some changes in it from that? I would say yes. To what degree are those changes, or how massive are they? Hard to say. And last thing on that too is that on a few people who have done that, I measure their heart rate variability. So looking at the status of their autonomic nervous system. And so far, which granted is, an N of about 3 people at this point, their heart rate variability stuff is all really messed up. So far, all 3 of them have been, probably, I would say, completely overtrained, right? So I think we're mixing up a lot of times metabolic damage with possibly overreaching or overtraining, right? Because if you take someone and you have them, a lot of times they're very motivated people. They do a lot of exercise. Their performance is dropping, but they keep trying harder, and they're restricting calories. That's a pretty good model to get people to be overreached and overtrained pretty fast, right? So I think there's that component too, which involves the immune system and everything else. So the takeaway is that, you don't need to do anything super extreme. If you did do something super extreme, can that probably be fixed? Yep. That's been my experience in talking to other coaches like Lane Norton and some other guys. It appears that it can be fixed, but if you abused your body and did that for 2 to 3 years, it's probably going to take you possibly a couple of years to fix it again, right? I mean, that's just, kind of the way it works. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but.
Yeah, it basically what you're saying is that it's a very complicated situation, and we really don't know right now, and I think in the future we'll find out more and learn more. But basically, it's kind of one of those things that we're kind of trying to still figure out. I would agree with that, and I would say that based on the literature we have now, it doesn't appear that you can permanently damage your metabolic rate. You will see changes. And, maybe we'll have hopefully more data in the future on, more of the extremes on, the ends of the spectrum on that. And then I am doing a panel at the ISSN conference coming up on basically that topic.
so metabolic adaptations. So on the panels myself, Dr. Lane Norton, Dr. Abby Smith-Ryan, and Dr. Dom D'Agostino. So, so that'll be very interesting too. So,
yeah, I think that one of the problems is, like we were talking about earlier, is that like everyone's different, and so like you said before, like people are eating Slurpees and they're still living, and it's like not killing over. It's because the body is such an amazing, thing that it can take all this punishment and still keep on going and still keep on going. And I think that's one problem we're running into with these people that are, dieting and exercising, is like they're exercising to the max and they're eating as little as possible, which is a huge stress on the body. And that's where we're running into, is like all these people that look healthy are actually, worse off than a lot of people that are eating Slurpees, just because they're putting so much stress on their body. And at least that's my opinion. But I think that's the issue, is that we kind of still really don't know, and we're still trying to, figure it out through science and through, anecdotal cases and everything. But I think we're about out of time today, Dr. Mike. So if the listeners, they wanted to get in contact with you or learn more about you, where would they go?
Sure. Best place to go is just www.miketnelson.com. So MIKETNELSON. And if they search around on there, I've got 6 free videos for fat loss that kind of goes over some of the concepts we talked about. And if they want, they could email me. It's just drmike@miketnelson.com. And then just put subject line action item, and then I will try to get back to them as best I can. I try to answer most emails, but unfortunately I can't get to all of them, but I'll do my best. So.
All right. Well, thank you once again, discussing your ideas around metabolic flexibility, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. Take care.
All right. Bye. All right.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Dr. Mike. This is one of the last recorded podcast archive interviews I have left, and I hope you are still finding value and gaining useful information from these old interviews. If you know of any experts that resonate with this information, or anyone that has had success with weight loss after failing to lose weight while following conventional weight loss recommendations, I would love to have them on the show and help expand the weight loss conversation to beyond just calories. And with that said, this is Coach Strick saying thanks for listening, and remember, when calories in, calories out doesn't work, that, my friend, is a calorie conundrum.
This podcast, including Coach Strick and guests, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects for the use of any information contained herein. Coach Strick and/or guests may recommend products or services in which they have a direct or indirect financial interest. To find out more, please visit www.calorieconundrum.com.